It's a common feeling around the world that France is one of the most romantic places on earth. Majestic castles and medieval manicured villages steeped in ancient history, with a swish of fine wine. From the breathtaking cliffs along the coast of Normandy to the Mediterranean beaches of the south, it's a land infused with natural and man-made beauty. Great rivers like the Rhône and the Seine, and the cities that grew up around them, from the earliest histories invigorate the bardic spirit of many. Yet it isn't the landscape that primarily defines France. It is its people. Those who have been laying its bricks and stones over thousands of years, who bake the bread and make the wines and cheeses, and over whose tongues roll the elegant speech which many consider to be the most beautiful language in the world. It is the French people who make France what it is, and without whom it would cease to be. But who are they? What are their origins, and what makes them so unique and fascinating that they have played such a defining role in the history of the world? Who are the French? Hi friends, I'm Kevin McLean. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and consider supporting the channel on Patreon, PayPal, or through YouTube Super Stickers. My humble thanks to all of my supporters. While people have inhabited Western Europe for tens if not hundreds of thousands of years, there are two prehistoric populations which primarily influence the modern genetic makeup of the French. A 2020 genetic study titled The Genetic History of France concluded that between 46 to 66% of French ancestry can be traced to the Neolithic farmer population, with the lowest proportions in the north. Though the far earlier hunter-gatherer populations have left a remarkable array of cave paintings like those of Lascaux and other artifacts demonstrating remarkable artistic talent over 20,000 years ago, their cultural and genetic impact on later populations was much smaller. Originating in Anatolia, the Neolithic farmers by 5000 BC had settled throughout much of Western Europe. They constructed many wondrous stone monuments which still draw people today, such as the Karnak stones, the Cairn of Barnenais, the Locmariaque megaliths, and the tumulus of Bougon, and countless others. Many of these monuments share characteristics with those of Ireland and Britain during the same period, and are known as the megalithic culture, which incorporated many peoples living near the Atlantic coast. Yet around 2700 BC, a new group from the east begins to appear in regions of modern France with the Yamnaya ancestry, originating in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. These people, known as the Bell Beakers, spread into the east of France and along the northern coasts as far as Portugal and south into Italy. It was these Indo-European people who would plant the seeds which would later blossom into the historic period languages and cultures that would reshape Europe. Yet unlike in Britain and Ireland, where the majority of the Neolithic farmers seem to have died off after the arrival of the Beaker people, in regions of France there was a far greater fusion with the existing population, and as a result, lower steppe ancestry on average as compared to Britain, and much of northern and eastern Europe. As they do geographically, so genetically, France formed a midway point between southern and northern Europeans. By the Middle Bronze Age, the European steppe-derived population had spread throughout most of modern France, and fused with the earlier population to create a new cultural identity. It was dominated by Indo-European traditions, but also absorbed some local elements. This culture and its language would explode across Bronze Age Europe in a dramatic way. By 1700 BC, the Bronze Age in Western Europe was in full swing, and powerful regional civilizations were spreading their territorial influence and control. An advanced trade network existed that stretched from Britain to the eastern Mediterranean, exporting the precious tin which was required for the manufacture of the highest quality bronze. In later historic times, Greek historian Herodotus said that he believed this trade from the Tin Islands came through Gaul, and likely at least some of it had since the early Bronze Age. Some amber may have also reached the Mediterranean cultures via the same routes, as later Greek and Roman myths connect its origin to Celtic lands, though its ultimate source was in the Baltic Sea. Yet by 1600 BC, a distinct cultural group had formed on the fringes of France. Their territory extended as far as Poland and south into the Alps. They are called the tumulus culture for the large tumuli they built for their honored dead. They constructed grand hilltop fortresses and crafted many curious and remarkable artifacts. At least some of the beautiful and mysterious golden hats are thought to date to this period, and potentially belong to a priestly class. The tumulus culture gradually morphed into the Urnfield culture, which spread much further into France, and finally the Hallstatt culture. Though most famously connected to Hallstatt, recent genetic studies suggest that they spread throughout the whole of France, Iberia, Britain, and Ireland, and that this was the great Bronze Age empire of salt that resulted in the spread of the Proto-Celtic language throughout Europe. From around 1400 BC on, these Celtic peoples would shape the cultural, linguistic, and genetic structure of France. The culture would not remain static, yet there was also remarkable continuity from the Bronze Age gold hat of Aventon around 1400 BC to around 400 BC and the rise of the Latin style. Recent genetic studies suggest that this Bronze Age Celtic period may have been more interconnected and politically organized than previously thought, as elite burials in different regions have been found to contain close relatives, suggesting the existence of a pan-Gaulish ruling elite. Later Roman accounts also suggest that the Celts in the past had been more politically united than in the times of Julius Caesar. This unity was preserved in the religious customs, in which druids of all tribes were respected, exempt from military service, and would gather annually to make communal decisions. Similar pan-ethnic organization and law is recalled in medieval Gaelic sources, suggesting its roots may have been in the religious and organizational structures of the Hallstatt period. The Celts of Gaul did have a conception of themselves as a distinct ethnos, no different than the Greeks of the same period. These Bronze and Iron Age peoples of France were no simple barbarians. As the Mycenaeans were building Mycenae, dozens of sites of similar magnitude were also being built by the Celts of France. Because the Celts built with wood and smaller stone, these sites are not as well preserved, but they were not smaller or less sophisticated. They were producing marvelous plate armor, some of the best that existed anywhere in the world, and their weaponsmithing techniques were second to none. Their bronzesmithing technology was so advanced that they produced items estimated to be as technically challenging as the much later bronze casting of Greek statues. By 600 BC, Greeks had begun to arrive along the Mediterranean coast of France. They founded various colonies, one of which would become the city of Marseille. And by 400 BC, Greek influence began to express itself in the Celtic world, with the birth of the Latin artistic style and the regional development of statuary, which took inspiration from the Greeks. It was around that same time that the Gauls would begin to spread not only to the far east following the Danube, but also south into Italy. Conflict ensued. Led by Brennus, the Gauls defeated the Roman army in 387 BC in the Battle of Alia. They might well have put an end to Rome, but the Celts were more accustomed to raiding than conquering, though their descendants would later regret it. Roman poet Lucan mentions the Celts of Gaul worshipping Totates, Essus, and Tyrannus. Totates and Essus were both variously linked to Mars or Mercury, while Tyrannus is equated with Jupiter in his giant fighting form. Possibly this group formed a triad of deities similar to the old Roman triad of Mars, Uranus, and Jupiter, or the Gallic triad of Nuada, Dagda, and Lugh. There were many different names ascribed to the gods, and every tribe had their own set of favorite names. They famously worshipped in groves, but they likewise had wooden temples within sacred demarcated space. They made sacrificial offerings into water, which proved to be a large source for our archaeological knowledge of them. At least some elements of their religion would have been similar to the Romans. Celtic ingenuity and flash was further developed in the La Tène period, with the invention of chainmail, the refinement of helmets and sword designs, and the ornate torques that would adorn the necks of the nobility. All of these technological advances, first made by the Celts, were imitated by the Romans. But due to their centralization, the Romans were better able to mass-produce them. Though many of the Celts dwelling in the regions of modern Italy were conquered and assimilated into the Roman Republic in the conclusion of the Punic Wars, Rome's effort to conquer all the Celts of Gaul would not become a top priority for another 100 years. Logically, the first region to fall into their control was that around Massalia. The Greek city agreed to come under Roman protection, and the Romans seized the wider region from the Celts in the Transalpine War of 125 to 121. This became the province of Transalpine Gaul. By the time of the Transalpine War, Gaul was intensely politically divided along tribal lines. Major tribes like the Aedui, Arverni, Treveri, Parisi, and others vied for power and influence, even as Germanic tribes pushed further south and west. One region of ancient Gaul with disputed origins is Belgica. The name corresponds to modern Belgium. But in the Roman period, it extended further into the regions now part of France. Roman sources differentiated them from Celts, though Strabo mentions that the differences were small. It's probable that the region was a mix of Germanic and Celtic tribes even at that time, and represented a blending of the two. The Cimbri, according to Roman sources, having originated in modern Denmark or northeastern Germany, began a mass migration blamed on the flooding of their region. They defeated a number of Celtic tribes until they reached the regions of the Taurisci, who were allied with the Romans and called on their aid. In 58 BC, under the leadership of Gaius Julius Caesar, Rome would embark on a full-scale effort to conquer all the lands of the Celts in the region of modern France. Despite valiant efforts to resist by many, by 52 BC they had largely succeeded. A last-minute effort to consolidate leadership of the Gaulish tribes by Vercingetorix and amass a pan-Celtic force able to take on the Romans was defeated by the quick wit, strategic mind, and steel nerves of Caesar. Had such a political unity been achieved prior to or earlier in the war, things very likely would have turned out differently. Julius Caesar himself remarked that if the Gauls were united, there wasn't a force on earth that could have stopped them. To many, Vercingetorix still stands as an important symbol of French identity and resistance. Many Gauls died in the war, and many more were enslaved, though estimates vary widely. However, despite the establishment of some Roman colonies, most of the population of the Roman period Gaul continued to be of Celtic origin. Earlier Gaulish towns were expanded into cities, and the elite began to adopt Latin. The city of Lyon's original name was Lugdunum, meaning fortress of Lugh. The Romans made it their administrative center and established an annual assembly there, which representatives of the Gaulish regions were required to attend. It involved a cult of the emperor and worship of his spirit, but very likely the entire thing had a pre-Roman origin, linked to the festival in Ireland called Lunasa. In Irish tradition, Lugh is the heroic warrior who secures the total rule of Ireland against invading evil spirits, and he also legitimizes kings. This idea seems to have been conferred upon the spirit of the emperor in Gaul, who is often depicted as Jupiter and appears in numerous altars co-dedicated to the god of the skies, whom Julius Caesar identifies as being the one to hold the sovereign powers of heaven. A seasonal mosaic from Saint-Germain-le-Gaul, a short distance from Lugdunum, shows that the native god worshipped at this exact time of year was the god who stands atop the pillar, sometimes holding a wheel, who may be infrequently called Tyrannus. The Romans tried to use and integrate Gaulish customs and belief to legitimize and secure their rule, but Roman assimilation would be neither swift nor without local resistance. There were many rebellions by the local population, and Romans believed the Druids were in part responsible and took measures to try to stamp them out. How successful it was and how far these measures were taken is hard to say, but hundreds of years later we find Gallo-Roman priests calling themselves the descendants of Druids. The independent Gaulish identity would frequently bubble to the surface throughout the Roman Empire, significantly in the AD 69 Batavian Revolt, but even as late as the establishment of what is now called the Gallic Empire in AD 260. Marcus Cassianius Latinius Postumus, a Roman commander likely of Germanic origin, assumed control of Gaul when the Roman army there rebelled against the leadership of Emperor Gallienus and recognized Postumus, the successful commander, as emperor. He drew his support from local Gauls, who rapidly set about re-Gallicizing Gaul. Coins were minted reflecting the images of traditional Celtic and Germanic gods, sometimes stripped of their Roman guise. Gauls filled the administration, and the language may have also reasserted itself. This period provides clear evidence of a continued Gaulish identity even after 300 years of Roman rule. While some call into question how much the rule of Postumus really reflected a desire for national sovereignty, there can be little doubt that there was a strong ethnic component at play. However, when Postumus was murdered by his own troops for trying to prevent them from plundering, it was soon brought back under Roman authority. By the 3rd century AD, Christianity was rapidly spreading throughout the Western Roman Empire, predominantly in large commercial cities, and Gaul was not exempt. Gallo-Roman France produced an impressive number of saints still widely known today, such as Martin of Tours, John Cassian, Ambrose, and many others. When paganism was outlawed by the Roman state, the traditional temples were closed, and bands of fanatics desecrated many sites and statues, though pre-Christian beliefs lingered on for a long time, especially in rural areas. By the end of the 4th century, the Western Roman Empire was in deep crisis caused by the large number of Germanic migrants. The significant punch came from the Visigoths, but they were quickly followed by many others. This is not only reflected in Roman history, but has been seen in genetics. Populations began appearing in southern Germany and parts of Gaul which were identical to those of Scandinavia. Though over the next few hundred years there would be a mixing between the previous Celtic group and the incoming Germanic group, it was the Germans who held political power, and in the regions where there was a significant Germanic migration, Germanic became the common language. Thus, the former heartland of the Hallstatt Celts is now in Austria. Though their genetic impact was not as large in regions now part of France, Germanic tribes gained political power. The most famous and long-lasting of these was, of course, the Franks, who lend their name to the modern population and the language, despite neither being primarily Germanic. The Franks were likely an amalgamation of various Germanic tribes who had consolidated out of the necessity of the times to establish themselves as a power over the Gallo-Roman population. Their first king to establish himself in Roman-held territory was Clodio, from whom later Merovingian kings were, according to Gregory of Tours, said to descend. By 534, the Frankish Merovingian dynasty had defeated the Visigoths and the Burgundians to gain control over almost all the territory of modern France, with the notable exceptions of Brittany, which had been settled by Celtic Britons and would remain independent for a long time. Yet despite their political control, the majority of the population of France continued to speak local dialects of Latin, with the possibility that some rural people even at this time were still speaking Gaulish. This so-called vulgar Latin morphed over time to become not only the language known as French today, but the many other local languages of the region. The pronunciation of Latin, which resulted in the modern languages, is thought to have been influenced by Gaulish, and there are over 100 words in the French language of Gaulish origin, largely words related to plants, agriculture, and pastoral activities, showing that rural people held onto the Gaulish language the longest. While initially ruling as Germanic lords, the Franks of France would eventually become assimilated into the wider Gallo-Roman derived society and language. During the early rule of these Franks, a very significant event in the course of Western European history was decided. By 710, the Visigoths had been defeated, and most of Iberia had fallen to the host of the Umayyad Caliphate. Yet they were not content with only this. In 719, they began to invade regions of modern France, seizing the region of Septimania, which is around the area of Nimes and Narbonne. Charles Martel, Duke and Prince of the Franks, would rise to accept the challenge to the fate of Europe. Martel was a nickname meaning the Hammer, which poetically describes his greatest feat. In 732, Odo the Great, Duke of Aquitaine, was defeated by the Umayyad as they marched yet further north. Odo was able to retreat and sought out the Frankish Duke Charles to warn him about the impending Umayyad attack on Tours and join forces to keep back the Islamic invasion. Though outnumbered, Charles Martel dealt the Umayyad forces a crushing hammer blow that broke the force of their conquest. In 735, the Umayyad tried again to conquer France, but it too was defeated by Charles. All the lands that had been taken by the Umayyad north of the Pyrenees would be taken back by King Pepin, son of Charles, and founder of the Carolingian dynasty in 759. Yet despite this remarkable historical feat, Pepin is overshadowed by his son, Charlemagne. Under the rule of Charlemagne, the Franks expanded their kingdom to occupy what is today France, Germany, Austria, and much of Italy, and more. By 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne emperor. Yet this top-down political unity had no real basis within the populations on the ground, and in 843 Treaty of Verdun, it would be divided between the three sons of Louis the Pious. Arguably, that division was partly drawn up along ethno-linguistic lines, leading to East Francia being largely Germanic, and West Francia being largely Gallo-Roman. Central Francia likely included some of both, while also including the Italian holdings, which is why it did not survive long. The region of West Francia is the basis of modern France, geographically, culturally, and linguistically. though still ruled by a Germanic elite who titled themselves Kings of the Franks, and likewise codified Germanic-style laws. The basis of the state rested upon an overwhelmingly dominant Gallo-Roman population. By the 9th century, West Francia, like much of Europe, was suffering under the scourge of the Vikings. Rollo the Infamous was the tip of this spear. In 885 it was thrust at the heart of Paris, when he and his Vikings besieged the city for a year less a month, as they went up and down the Seine with their crafty vessels, raiding, plundering, and killing. They were finally defeated by Odo, who was made king afterwards, but they had seized territory in the north, which became known as the County of Rouen. In 911, Rollo would again try his luck at sacking cities. He was defeated by Robert I and Richard, Duke of Burgundy. Yet, in exchange for his fealty and his military service, he was not only allowed to live, but was granted the territory he had seized earlier, which became Normandy. In 987, Hugues Capet, whose family held power in the Ile-de-France region of the earlier Parisii, had managed to secure his election as King of the Franks. His male descendants would hold power in France until 1848, with only a few interruptions. Originally, the French kingship did not possess significant power, and the Norman invasion and conquest of England not only led to the dramatic rise in Norman power, but to the intertwining of noble families in France and England, which led to a disastrous consequence and a critical situation for France, when large regions such as Aquitaine came into the possession of the King of England through inheritance. The situation would eventually result in the 100 Years' War. It was during the 100 Years' War that one of the greatest heroes of France was made. Born to a simple peasant family with 50 acres of land, Joan of Arc could probably not read or write, but tended to the fields and animals. When she was 13, her town was raided, and she had a vision. Saint Michael appeared to her, and from then on he would repeatedly return. A prophecy circulating in the region, reportedly made by Merlin the Druid, stated that a virgin carrying a banner would save France. She gained a large following, and when she was 17, she was given an audience with Charles VII. She made a distinct impression on him, and he decided to put her skills to use. She helped inspire the army and was present on the battlefield carrying her banner. However, Joan was captured by the English, imprisoned, and tried for heresy. She was publicly executed in Paris by being tied to a post and burned to death. Her remains were cast into the Seine. Yet 22 years after her murder, the English would be expelled from France, and Joan would be rehabilitated. While there is a massive amount of important history that unfolded throughout the Middle Ages and the modern period, one event stands out for its impact on French ethnic identity: the Wars of Religion. The rise of Protestantism in Europe sparked tensions across societies. Religion forms a significant part of a group identity, and thus religious differences and conflicts are a form of ethnic conflict. The strife between Protestants and Catholics in France between 1562 and 1598 was a civil war, and though concessions were originally given to Protestants after its conclusion, they were soon withdrawn, and Protestantism was suppressed until the French Revolution. While a lot of the history focuses on the attacks committed by Catholics against them, the reality was not so black and white. Huguenot fanatics were attacking and killing priests, nuns, monks, destroying sacred relics and burning churches. These actions caused Catholics to become enraged and responded with mass violence, which is of course terrible, but is an inevitable part of intense ethnic and religious strife. A Protestant France could have meant a very different French culture than we know today. Fervent Protestant iconoclasts erasing saints, tearing down statues, stripping churches of decoration, tearing down monasteries. The victory of Catholicism had a massive and long-lasting impact on French identity that's difficult to overestimate. During the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, the regions controlled by France expanded. Some regions, which were ethnically and linguistically Germanic, were incorporated, such as Lorraine, but also places such as Corsica, the homeland of Napoleon, which continues to be a political issue in the present. France also acquired various colonial holdings in Asia and Africa that had disastrous results still much felt today. However, the largest and most long-lasting spread of ethnic French people occurred in the establishment of New France in North America. Though sporadic settlement by French explorers began as early as the 1540s, it was dramatically escalated with the 1608 establishment of Quebec, sponsored by King Henry IV. Despite the Kingdom of France losing political control of New France in 1763, in Canada the French settlers survived and even prospered into the present, the most well-known being the Quebecois, who are largely comprised of the descendants of the earliest French settlers and who continued to build their own distinct French nation with its roots in the pre-revolutionary French culture, which will be covered in a separate video. With the loss of New France and the poor financial situation by the 1780s, the social situation was coming again to a boiling point. French people saw the nobility as being completely out of touch with the interests and desires of the people. On the 17th of June, 1789, the National Assembly was established, which produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, inspired by the American Declaration of Independence. The third article is important to get a sense of the general feeling and the concept that was truly revolutionary. The principle of any sovereignty lies primarily in the nation. No corporate body, no individual may exercise any authority that does not expressly emanate from it. What was meant by nation is what we tend to call today the ethnic group. It isn't a random collection of individuals. It's a people, unified by a common ancestry, history, and culture. Before the Revolution, France had been ruled by kings that ruled over their people in their own interest, like a manager runs a company. The origin of kings was a noble one, rooted in tribal leadership. They were people from the tribe and tied to its fate. But by the Middle Ages, it had become a totalitarian elite, totally detached from the people. The French revolutionaries sought to return power to the tribe, the nation. The idea of the French nation taking destiny into its own hands was at the core of this revolutionary spirit. Though it was arguably subverted, the spirit of the times was of national liberation for the French people. That sovereignty rested with the ethnos was and still is a revolutionary idea. The French are now facing a situation no less dire than in the many pivotal points of their great history. Unless decisive action is taken soon, in another century, there may be no France. Yet if the French people can recapture that revolutionary spirit of national struggle with the banner of Vercingetorix, John Martel, and Joan of Arc, they can reforge the greatness of France. As Napoleon Bonaparte once said, the illustrious Joan proved that there is no miracle which French genius cannot accomplish when national independence is threatened. Well, I hope you liked the video. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks to all my friends and supporters. And as always, stand tall.